Hi, good morning to everyone joining us today. I see there are many audios connecting. And my name is Yeliz Mert. I'm from B-Lab Europe team, and I will be your host today. I work as the country partner manager for the European network, and I call it as harmonizer for the European network as well. And I will be in a conversation today with Erinch Sahan from Doughtnut Economics Action Lab. I'm very excited to have this conversation with him. As we are getting started, and I will be doing my intro, I also want to ask everyone coming in to join us today, where you are joining us from. Maybe in the chat you can let us know. It's really fun, to see with this European diversity of different individuals joining from all different parts of Europe. So curious to hear where you are all from, and any other thing that you would like to let us know about, what you're curious about today's conversation. Also feel free to drop in the chat. So to do a little bit of context setting for today and why we gathered today to have this conversation, I would like to make an intro. Is we know the Coffee and Good Company series are led by B-Lab Europe team since the early June this year. And we, as B-Lab, essentially work as the organization that rolls out the B Corp movement in Europe and globally, for those maybe who are joining from other organization with or from Interdependence Coalition. And B Corps are for-profit businesses that are asked to achieve certain performance targets, as well as changing their legal articles to include the interest of all stakeholders. And therefore, really the practitioners of this term of stakeholder governance. And today, actually, stakeholder governance is really the topic, and not only today, but the topic of the Coffee and Good Company series overall. So we are going to today hear from Erinch from Doughtnut Economics Action Lab, but since early June, we've been hearing from B Corp leaders and friends in this world of impact sector who are practicing stakeholder governance. Just a little bit more context, I think, to deepen why we're having these series is that earlier this year, European Commission set out a new consultation around sustainable corporate governance. And B-Lab, together with 60 B Corps, have submitted a response to this consultation. And we wanted to show a library of cases that we've been gathering over the years with B Corp movement, that what stakeholder governance really in practice is, and that it does work, and it does have a proof of concept, and that it should be integrated into the European Union legislation at this point, and to really play into that new world that we want to create with the also Green New Deal. So as we are waiting the response, the proposal outcome from the European Commission, we are gathering, every week or two on these Wednesday mornings with a cup of coffee for most people. For me today, it will be my tea. So feel free to pick your own drink and comfort yourselves in this morning's conversation. We will be unpacking the story of stakeholder governance further and demystify this concept a little bit more. So I want to turn now to Erinch. Erinch, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Really big pleasure for me to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Yeliz. It's an absolute pleasure to join you guys to talk about what is a really critical topic, because I think at the core of what we're talking about is a very honest critique about what's not working in our global economy, which is that we have businesses that are set up for one stakeholder only, the shareholder, and with one goal in mind only, which is to extract capital, extract wealth, extract value for that shareholder as quickly as possible. And that is a problem. It's a limiting factor. And I think stakeholder governance is one of those critical conversations that we need to deepen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's 21st century values, right? We were creating that new system and that new set of values. Erinch, we want to hear a little bit about who you are, what's your background, and also you recently joined Doughtnut Economics Action Lab, and I want to hear, what's your role in it, but also if you can give us a glimpse of, what is Doughtnut Economics Action Lab, or DEAL as shortened, is set to achieve, and what role do you see for businesses in that vision?
Yeah, thank you, Yeliz. I mean, firstly to say I am very new to the Doughtnut economics world and community. I had the great honor until recently of being the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization, which is an amazing, inspiring network and verifier of social enterprises and social businesses that fully practice fair trade. And that's no mean feat. To do that, to effectively implement the 10 principles of fair trade is a huge thing. So that was a big part of what I did for 3.5 years. And I was at Oxfam before that. I was at the Australian government before that, doing some development work with farmers in Indonesia. And I had a short corporate career before that as well, at Procter Gamble and in corporate law for a while. So I've sort of done the rounds and learned a lot across all of those. I continue to learn. The reason I'm particularly excited about Doughtnut Economics is because it's a big macro picture about where we're going and where we need to go as a planet, as a species, as a global community. I mean, what Doughtnut Economics is really, it's a compass for human prosperity in the 21st century. So the aim is meeting the needs of all people within the means of our living planet. And both of those components are really critical, Yeliz, because it's really about all people. At the moment, we're leaving a lot of people behind. There are hundreds of millions of people who are still left hungry and trapped in poverty around the world, spiraling inequality, huge sort of social issues. And on the planet side, we're massively overshooting on the ecological footprint that our planet can bear. So, that Doughtnut Economics tries to address that, and it comes through a very simple but powerful framework of a donut that consists of 2 concentric rings. So think of the first concentric ring, which is a social foundation, which is to ensure that nobody is left falling short of life's essentials. And above that, a second concentric ring, which is a ring that says that's an ecological ceiling that we have to live within, which is to ensure that humanity does not collectively overshoot the planetary boundaries that Earth's life supporting systems have. So between these two, the ecological ceiling and the social foundation, there's a sort of a donut-shaped space that is both ecologically safe and socially just. And that's the space in which humanity can thrive. So if you take that concept, which almost feels impossible to disagree with, of course we live on a planet that has boundaries and has limits. And of course we want everybody to meet the essentials of life. But the implications on our economic system are enormous, and the implications on business and trade is even larger, and that's where I think stakeholder governance really kicks in.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully described, and how business fits in that middle space as an act of creation of that world, right? And I think in the screens right now, many people will be familiar with the book. In any case, I think it's it's not a foreign concept for the group of people here, but I hope that it's also introduced it to some new people as well. Erinch, I want to go into this topic of stakeholder governance with you to really unpack, from your perspective, from years of experience, but also from DEAL. But we just came out of a COP. And I cannot not ask, what are your, senses around it, and, how do you feel like it is, what happened or didn't happen at COP? I kind of feel like, not really, I don't want to be bounded by, what happened or didn't happen in COP. And I'm curious about your sense of how does it touch to your work? What do you feel about that?
It brings urgency, greater urgency to the work that we're all doing. All of these movements, ideas, initiatives that are trying to remake and reformulate our global economic system. The results from COP, which everyone could decide for themselves, but it's a mixture of some positives with some very disappointing aspects, and it kind of reinforces the fact that we need to step up and speed up in the way we transform business and trade. And there's a big role for business, there's a big role for entrepreneurs, there's a huge role for consumers in there, there's a big role for investors in there. So I think if anything, it sort of focuses the mind that we've got to do a lot of this heavy lifting as well from the side of all these different stakeholders that are trying to change the world and trying to use their voice, particularly as citizens, to make that big change.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, very much on the same page. And with that sense, then I want to, go into, our exploration of the stakeholder governance, because I'm curious, with your years of experience on working on transforming the business world, and, you work very closely with, which as part of a trade organization. From your experience, do we have the right models for 21st century yet? Where are we on that? And, maybe also a little bit, bringing in the stakeholder governance into that picture, that why is it then so critical? Why is it even significant?
Well, I think we've got a system that is designed for an early era, when financial capital was in short supply and businesses had to try to maximize their desirability for financial capital. So, yep, have complete dominance of my board. Yep, take all of the profits. Yep, make yourself the priority of everything I do. And that's what sort of evolved in the 20th century. In the 21st century, I think we've come to discover there are other things that are much more precious, actually, particularly our living planet and our wonderful societies and human beings that live on it. And we need to put them also into the picture. And that's where I think stakeholder governance comes in. The big thing I learned, particularly during my time at World Fair Trade Organization, was that, and I think the fair trade world does this quite well, is it really recognizes which stakeholder needs to be the priority. And the priority in those supply chains, in those businesses, are the marginalized producers. It's the workers, the farmers, the artisans. There's no blurring, there's no confusion about that. That is the priority. And then let's build businesses, let's build trading rules and systems around making them the priority. So I think I've seen a lot of stuff. I mean, I've done some teaching at universities on stakeholder models and stakeholder theory. And sometimes there's a bit of a lure into going, let's consider everybody equally. But some stakeholders already have power in the system. Some stakeholders already are protected by government. Some stakeholders already are in a privileged position. And I think what true 21st century stakeholder governance needs to do is recognize the existing power dynamics and recognize that you need to tip the balance in favor of those that are most marginalized. And if it's individuals, then often it's going to be individuals in your supply chain. It might be the community around you. It might be a consumer if you're selling products that are targeting the bottom of the pyramid sort of models of production. It might be Mother Nature, and it might be, there's no getting around the fact that the use of water resources, or use of, forest resources, or the carbon footprint is actually the biggest thing. And okay, let's tip the balance in favor of that. So I think a big danger in stakeholder governance is saying, all stakeholders, let's have all their voice somehow heard, without a recognition that some are already systematically excluded. And there needs to be special effort to make sure that the stakeholder governance model is giving a bit of a lift to those, and giving greater voice, greater power, greater priority to those that are most marginalized in that system.
I really like that you're especially emphasizing that part, Erinch, because I mean, I wanted to get into this topic of how do we balance the different needs of stakeholders, but maybe we are not necessarily talking about needs-based of stakeholders very often, but interest-based, and more so in the self-interest base. And I'm curious, climate justice and social justice are becoming ever more bigger part of the work that we are doing. As we go into climate crisis, we realize that it's actually not only an environmental crisis, but there are a whole other set of implications that we are seeing. And this just transition is really an important part of it as well. And we know that there will be changes in the world because some industries are already outdated and they will need to go through, transformation of, large transformation of business model or adaptations of businesses. And this will affect, of certain workers, industries. How do you think stakeholder governance can actually play a role in this new era of building an economy that's fit for 21st century, and it's allowing everyone to rise?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example of what might transpire and maybe has begun to transpire a little bit. So think of circular economy. We're all big champions of it. I mean, most of the talks I'm giving nowadays have circular economy theory and examples as a really central part of it. However, we could get this really desperately wrong. Imagine we get to a point where we replace 10,000 livelihoods in the global south with 14 engineering jobs in the global north as we have highly mechanized circular production models. That's not going to work for our planet or our species either. We're going to need to find a way, which is where the donut reminds us, you can't just run off and address one problem without the other. If you're going to address the planetary boundaries, you need to do it in a way that also makes sure that everybody is able to access life's essentials. So what stakeholder governance can do in that specific example is bring in the voice of the workers, bring in factory workers, bring in the voice of farmers, bring in the voice of artisans, people who are currently earning their livelihood, often earning a very insufficient livelihood out of the current status quo, but a complete elimination and decimation of those sectors by a very non-thought through and a careless transition to a circular economy model, for instance, would be incredibly damaging and wouldn't sustain itself. We would create social incohesion and instability and all sorts of other problems that would then come back to bite us anyway. So what would stakeholder governance do there? It would say, recognize that, hey, the workers, farmers, artisans in the global south, the communities there need to have a significant voice at the table. So maybe they need a seat on the board. Maybe they need 2 or 3 seats on the board. Maybe they need to we need to convert to a partial ownership model where, right, if mechanization is to happen, that leads us to wonderful circular production models, that part of the benefits of that are also going to them. So they've got shares maybe in this, and they've got a value distribution going back again. So I think it's a way of recognizing that this huge economic industrial transition that we're going to need to have doesn't happen in a way that's blind to those who are currently vulnerable if that's not done right. And stakeholder governance, and I think we need to go beyond some of these ideas that, we need to consider everybody's interests. Well, you can consider it and then do what you were going to do anyway. Or we need to give everyone a voice, right? We heard them and then we were going to do what we were going to do anyway. So there's, very tokenistic ways that can be done. Or there are ways where we actually look at the levers of power and be quite deliberate about, governance models around who's on the board, who gets access to information, whose interests are represented by management, who gets access to the value, the surplus, the profits, whose interests get to shape long-term investments. This is where governance rubber hits the road. And this is where I think the just transition is going to be just if we get the right stakeholders into that process.
Mm-hmm. And I love that also allows a new relationship between, companies functioning in a certain place with the communities and with the environment, with the nature of that place. It also creates a new opportunity for us to become, again, place-based human beings, maybe in a bit of a different form than what we had a couple of hundreds of years ago, but it replenishes that relationship that we're part of a place, and our communities are a crucial part of keeping us healthy as a society and as ecological parts of the world as well. I mean, Erinch, those are all amazing, but how are we going to, what are the incentives for companies, for organizations, for governments to really put the investment and time and thoughtfulness into creating this? And I know that you talk about, business innovation, and I think there are some, like new directions around, really rethinking the design of a business. And like essentially, I think there's this attempt of creating a new notion of business that's fit for 21st century. Maybe can you unpack that for us a little bit? What are the mechanisms that we could actually bring these ideas into practice?
Yeah, thanks. Yes. I mean, I think there's a few ways. So what I'm mandated to do at Doughtnut Economics Action Lab is to take this amazing theory, which is really a reflection on the state of our planet, and think about what does this mean for individual businesses? How do they become businesses that help us get into the donut rather than currently be a problem in that endeavor? So take us from, this incredibly destructive and degenerative model of production of take, make, use, lose that happens, to one where we are regenerative and we're actually putting more nutrients into the soil and cleaning up rivers, and we're spreading value far more equitably by being much more distributive. So that's not going to happen without us changing the fundamentals of enterprise, right? I mean, businesses do what they're often designed to do. You can have wonderful culture shifts that help nudge along certain things. You can have some really good practices, policies, management instruments, etc. But we need to get to the deep design of enterprise. And that means that we need to look at 5 things. And the 5 things originally come from an amazing thinker, writer called Marjorie Kelly at the Democracy Collaborative, who's written a book called Owning Our Future. And Kate Rayworth, my colleague and friend, has been the person who's borrowed some of that language and adapted it slightly into these 5, list of 5, which is firstly purpose. What is the purpose of the business? And being very deliberate about everything that might touch that purpose, including the core product or service that they're doing. So they might need to actually transition out of some of the products and services that they're providing. Someone providing tax avoidance services or tax minimization advisory services, for instance, maybe doesn't have, maybe needs to transition to a different kind of offering to their clients. And the same with, somebody who's maybe producing weapons or other things in this world. So really, what is the purpose? And being very clear about that. Second is about networks. So what networks are they in, including their supply chain networks, really central, like moving away from commodification and much more into long-term partnerships, etc. that happen. Again, fair trade movement's done a lot on this, and that's a very central part of it. Networks is also about what networks of businesses you're in, like a B Corp community, for instance, like some of the more progressive business networks that exist to try to also advocate for policies that are progressive and supportive of these ideas. The third is around governance, which stakeholder governance, absolutely central, But there's a lot of inspiration to be taken there also from things like steward ownership, where you've got different classes of shares that hold a purpose share, that the organization's foundation ownership, which allow you to lock in a purpose through including seats on your board and the like. The fourth is ownership. So who owns the business? And that really matters. Employee ownership, great. That's one of the models. But employee ownership by rich employees in the global north, for instance, doesn't necessarily translate into the other stakeholders in the global south. And here I think, again, stakeholder governance needs to distinguish between suppliers in terms of the businesses of the suppliers and the workers and farmers in those supply chains. So there's something to split off there, to think how can ownership also include a broader range of these kinds of models. And last is finance, the relationship with the money that's pumped into the business. Some really broad range of ideas can come into here, including limits on exits and different ways that investors can stick around longer term and have that kind of shared vision for the purpose of the business. So purpose, networks, governance, ownership, finance. Those are the 5 bits. And around that, we need to invent the enterprises of the future, because we need the innovation to happen here. We haven't cracked it. There's some amazing work being done by a whole range of movements around what the future enterprise needs to look like. But I feel like we're at the beginning of that journey. And we need a culture of innovation. We need a culture that goes beyond some of our tribal identities that are formed in this world, where I'm this kind of business, I'm that business, I use this label, I use that label, all of which are incredibly valuable in taking us in the narrative forward. But I don't think we've cracked it yet. Like, how do we represent the interests of Mother Nature and our planet in our business? No one's got a fantastic model for that yet. How do we limit the growth of a business where maybe increasing growth, increasing profits, increasing sales after a certain point might be too damaging and innately unsustainable for a particular area? none of us have cracked any of these things yet. So I think we need to spark that innovation, and that's what I'm excited about, Yeliz.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally see it, and I'm so excited, to be speaking to such an innovator, Erinch. And I'm conscious that we have a couple of minutes left only, but I want to get into, like, I think two things. One is that I think the pioneers are there, and the innovators and pioneers are so crucial at this time, as we are at the beginning of a new era only, where we only have a direction, but we don't know how we're going to do it. But what I'm also curious about is that there is also a huge conventional mainstream, business world or a society that also, needs to be bridged into this pioneering thinking and innovations. And I mean, I'm just curious, like if you have any glimpse on, these new business innovations and like this, we already know the design principles, but then how do we embed them? How do we into practice with more mainstream businesses? And what's the bridge that we can build there? If you can give, like share any of your, views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got lots of interesting experiments happening. There's a really interesting model that I remember coming across during my time at WFTO called El Puente. And El Puente is partly owned by its supply chain, by the workers and farmers in its supply chain, partly by its own workers, partly by the world shops in Germany, who are themselves community-owned organizations, and partly by the founders of it. And they all have a seat at the table, at the board table, and they all have shares, they all have a voice. There's multi-stakeholder governance model that has gone to the heart of things, not just sort of, wordsmithing some nice things on a piece of paper, actually going, right, let's get into where it actually matters and decisions are made. I think there are loads of models like that. There's models like, Manos del Uruguay, which has been, in Uruguay, that's owned by the workers themselves, the artisans spread across the country who own their own business that's now selling with its own brand around the world. There are some phenomenal enterprise design models out there. And I think we also need to be careful about not being too prescriptive about this, because A, we don't know what the right models are, and B, some of these formal structures are not necessarily appropriate for smaller micro businesses as well. So it's not, I've come across hundreds of businesses that don't have a board, and they, nor should they at their size yet. So they take on principles and practices in other ways that embed their purpose into their business. But I think what we can do is really learn from those that are on the cutting edge, but not confine ourselves to that, because we might need to actually go, oh, there's a really interesting model from the social enterprise movement around reinvesting majority of their profits. Oh, there's fantastic models for getting the right metrics into the boardroom for consideration of other stakeholder interests from the B Corp movement. Oh, there's fantastic stuff happening in the fair trade world around making sure that otherwise anonymized and invisible workers, farmers, and artisans get a voice and get priority. Like, I think it's going to be a bit of a blending exercise of pulling things across, and not necessarily just going, those are the components. Those are the beginnings of the components. Again, this steward ownership stuff has really captivated me recently, looking at all the businesses that have interesting sort of share classes to hold purpose in lock over time. I think we just need to keep innovating, not be judgmental, not say that's good, that's bad, that's right, that's wrong, they're a pioneer, they're a laggard, but actually just recognize that none of us have invented this yet. And we just sort of keep learning from each other. And the more the conversation moves, and this is where I really applaud the B Corp movement, is the more the conversation moves into saying, look, we need to systematically change the status quo business model away from shareholder primacy to stakeholder governance. The more we make that the main ball game, the more we're on the right track.
Yeah, and I actually, my last question, Erinch, is on that point. As you know, we launched Interdependence Coalition a number of months ago, and this essentially is a coalition of B Corps and friends organizations that wants to become a unified voice and become, if you like, a movement of movements, and then essentially really show the case to the European Commission that we do need stakeholder governance. And if we have it at a mandatory level, that will be for equality of everyone, because there's going to be a level playing field. And this is really one of the ways that we are taking this thing further. And I'm curious, like you look at it from a business innovation point of view, and I'm curious, like your thoughts around this as we're waiting for the consultation response to come early December. It's an exciting moment, and I guess like it's a blending, it's a blending of efforts as you shared. But what do you see the role of legislation and such initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely critical that we start moving from a bunch of voluntary, amazing, inspiring businesses doing some things to go in the right direction to one where we're starting to say, look, guys, we're innovating here in the private sector. Now it's time for government to innovate, to make sure that the floor is raised, that we're not at a disadvantage for doing business this way, because sometimes you can be more profitable by doing business and structuring yourself the way we're talking about here. Sometimes you do pay a price for that. You pay a cost because you don't want to push your externalities out into the world. You don't want to just say, look, I'll do what I can get away with. You voluntarily sometimes pay a higher price. You sometimes make investments into ecologically sustainable solutions, even if you're not rewarded in the marketplace. And that's what stakeholder governance can help you do. Because if it was going to maximize profits, you don't need stakeholder governance. Then the shareholders are already going to keep putting pressure on you to do that over time. And let's not change anything. We'll just stay where we are and eventually, drive off a cliff of spiraling inequality and ecological collapse. That's the future that awaits us unless we change. But the change is also going to happen when governments recognize, look, we built this thing this way. We built the Corporations Acts are built this way. Our industrial policies have shaped things. This was a choice to say, we put shareholders first. We make everybody accountable to them and to their interests. And everything else can only be considered if it can make the shareholders richer. The problem as well with this point, I just want to underline, is that right now, shareholder wealth maximization, it provides dividends to individuals on the basis of their wealth. I mean, we wouldn't accept this in most other parts of life. We wouldn't say, look, you get a vote at your local elections, depending on how big your house is. But in a company, your vote at the AGM depends on how big your shareholding is. Your dividend check at the end of the year depends on how big your shareholding is. So every year we reward the most wealthy the most, and then they own more, and they again get an even bigger dividend check. So the whole thing is almost designed to create spiraling inequality and spiraling wealth disparity. And that was a choice. We structured things. This is an institution. You don't walk around the forest and see shareholder wealth maximizing, profit maximizing companies walking around with lions and tigers. It's not a naturally occurring organ. We made this up, and governments and policies made this up. We can make new laws, and governments need to step up on this as well.
I think there were a couple of structures that we set off, on the wrong foot, and that brought us to this point, and we want to, rebalance some of those things. And we, in our conversation, we did also talk about, the capital system and what plays into that, and that's a whole, big part of this conversation as well. Erinch, I knew this was going to be a very rich conversation, and I'm so sorry to our audience that we didn't get a chance to really bring in some of your questions, but I think, Erinch, you will be in a number of new places. So I think the audience can find you and listen into what Doughtnut Economics Action Lab is planning to do in the next phase. As a fellow Turkish, it's been my great pleasure sharing this stage with you. I really thank you for all your work and this connection moment. And look forward to more work between our organizations and further on in the ecosystem with everyone.
Thanks, Yeliz. Yes, and just as a reminder, I think I've shared on my LinkedIn and Twitter as well, but tomorrow I'm speaking with an amazing group at Common Land around regenerative business development. And on Friday, actually, I'm speaking to the zebras community in the US, which has got huge parallels and huge overlaps with everything we've been talking about. So there's a lot of energy around these ideas, and how do we bring the ideas of Doughtnut economics to recreate a different enterprise design for the 21st century. It's an honor to have had this conversation also with a fellow Turk.
Beautiful, thank you. Before we close up to our audience, I also want to share that early December, we will hear about European Commission's consultation. And afterwards, we do want to gather up on a webinar and really talk about the different views on the consultation response and take the next steps together with our Interdependence Coalition partners. So please go to interdependencecoalition.eu website to check out more, and you can find also the recordings of these Coffee and Good Company series as well. Thank you so much for joining us all this morning for this 30-minute quick dynamic chat. I hope that you start with a good energy and have a good continuation of your day for the rest of the day.